Welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. We're diving deep into the intricate layers of the 7-stage generational wealth model to offer invaluable insights on legacy building, wealth accumulation and preservation, and financial growth across generations. I'm Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and this is the New Wealth Wave podcast. Hey, future wealth builders. Welcome to another episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast, where generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. I'm your host, Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and today we're taking a journey through all 7 stages of my 7-stage generational wealth model, which focuses on the past, the present, and the future of your financial story. Guiding us through this powerful conversation is Dr. Prince Sarpong, making his first appearance on the show, and I can promise you it will not be his last. Dr. Sarpong, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace, and I'm very happy that you invited me to your podcast.
This is going to be a great episode. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this work, let me break it down to you. Dr. Sarpong is an associate professor of finance, a certified financial planner, and a global voice in behavioral finance. He's the founder of the Center of Financial Psychology and Systems and currently serves on the advisory board as well. He's also the author of the widely used textbook series, Portfolio Management for Financial Advisors, Volumes 1 and 2. His work bridges fintech, financial therapy, and cognitive wealth building across generations. If you're new to the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you stay connected to these game-changing conversations we have. And if you haven't already, pick up my book, bestseller, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge, on Amazon. The link is in the description. So let's get into the 7-stage generational wealth model. As we said previously, it's based on 3 phases: the past, the present, and the future. So stage 1, we focus on our internal and external ecosystems, walls in and walls out, which creates our inherited financial narratives and encoded financial behaviors. Stage 2, we dive into the financial genetic code, targeting both our financial trauma and anxieties. Stage 3, it's all about financial healing, reprogramming our financial genetic code, which is a byproduct of stages 2 and 1. Stage 4, financial edification. Here we focus on financial literacy and inclusion. Stage 5, financial well-being. This is our soft landing. This is where financial health equals financial wealth. Stage 6, generational knowledge, which leads us into our financial footprints. To stage 7, generational wealth. So typically, before we get into the actual podcast episode, I always ask my guests 3 particular questions. The first question is, before you became who you are today, where were you located on the 7-stage generational wealth model?
That's an interesting one. Actually, I've been on stage 2 for a very long time.
So yeah, your financial genetic code, right? Dealing with financial
Yes.
trauma and anxiety. And you write about that. I mean, you're behavioral finance, so I'm sure that you have a lot you're going to share with us on that topic as well.
Yes.
So with that being said, since you're at stage 2, you spend a lot of time on stage 2, actually. What was your aha moment that you said change was imminent?
My aha moment came with, I suppose, funny enough, years of research when I realized that, you know what, I need to own my own narrative. And that was when the change started happening. We all experience our financial journeys differently, where for my case, I wouldn't call it the trauma in the traditional sense, but it's almost always when your narrative is dependent on another individual or another group of persons' expectations and narrative. So when you don't own your own narrative, you just remain stuck without you even noticing. So your whole financial behavior is not really about you, but pretty much about trying to disprove a certain narrative, or it's always been a situation where it's almost not about yourself, but you're always on the back foot trying to prove, or you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
absolutely.
the situation.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And that's where I love our conversation we're going to have today. And I'm going to introduce our future wealth builders, how we actually met as well, because I think it's a funny story behind that. So with that being said, the final question in our 3 questions I typically ask is, today, right now, today, where are you located on the model?
I would say Currently, I oscillate between 6 and 7. So I have very young girls, 15, 8, and then almost 2 years. And so I oscillate between generational knowledge, generational wealth, but at the same time, they are not that matured to pass on generational knowledge. So I try to curate it in a way that is more suitable to their age because it's never too early to start imparting generational knowledge. So I oscillate between 6 and 7 because well, I need to also craft a suitable knowledge for myself. I'm not done learning, and so I find myself oscillating between 6 and 7.
And listen, we have guests come on and say they start off at one, by the time they get through with the episode, they're on five. So they're constantly oscillating back and forwards. And that's the beauty of the model because you can go
Mm,
clockwise, you can go counterclockwise, you can jump back and forth, as you mentioned earlier. There's no particular path, no certain path, because each individual is different in their journey in this game called life, so to speak. Now, a
right.
funny story. Let me kind of set the stage on how we actually met. So, I've been following Dr. Sarpong for quite some time. We're on LinkedIn, and one day he makes a phenomenal post, and everyone's commenting on the post. And I sent Dr. Sarpong a direct message. I said, "Hey, you may want to take a look at my book I just released." He responded back quickly and he says, "I'm already reading it." And I was like, oh my God, here's someone that I've been following and admired for so long. He's actually reading the material. And then you took a screenshot, sent it to me, and I knew exactly where you were at. And I said, oh, wow, I know exactly where he's at. And we started talking about it. And I asked, I said, when you get through the book, provide me some input because I love to hear everyone's input after reading the book. So with that being said, we talked about the book, which just released on June 30th, as we mentioned earlier, Amazon bestseller, which I'm humbled by that. And just kind of give the future wealth builders your idea of what you discovered from the book and, your thoughts on it, why you think it's beneficial and why people should actually purchase the book.
When I finished reading the book, I had to go to write a comment on Amazon. So basically for me, it was just refreshing. Financial genetic code, I just can't get over it. So refreshing, in the way you capture our actual lived experiences in such true form as opposed to a studied generalized form. When you read, you feel it. There's just the learning where you're learning for knowledge, but there are some times when you learn and you just feel it. It's the transformation is happening and you can feel your story within the book. So that is what got me really glued to the book. And then generational knowledge, goodness, that is when, in fact, that is what made me grab the book. Like, okay, this is something that is missing, something that is not there. And it's very deep in that it's not just what is said or what is not said. Sometimes it's actually what is imposed. And so that is when I earlier said that I found myself stuck in the stage 2 on the financial genetic code for so long. That is where I felt was missing in conversation. So on one hand, you hear lots of stories about, well, we were not raised to ABC or our parents never taught us XYZ. Those were the normal narratives you usually hear. And of course, even with the systemic issues, especially in marginalized communities, it's also from the perspective of we were treated ABC or, whatever the case may be. But what is usually missing in the conversation, which you capture so succinctly in your book, is actually also the other element of that genetic code, which is basically imposed on you and you never even know it. Certain expectations that you live up to, it's not from your community, it's not from your parents, but it's pretty much imposed. The way you have to dress up to show up, not because, that's how you want to, but sometimes it's a way to blend in. It kind of follows you and sometimes even subconsciously. And at a point, you think you've weaved yourself into it, you think you've mastered the narrative, but these are not your narratives, and you find yourself living an imposed false narrative for so long. That was something that truly stuck with me, and I felt, wow, Dr. Wallace really have, unearthed something that needs to be heard. This is what got me to really finish the book because I had to, and also to recommend it to other people to say, hey, you should check this out. Trust me, it's not what you think you've read. So just give it a shot and see.
That's interesting that you say that because that was my driving point. The book was a self reflection of myself first,
Mhm.
internally, an inventory of myself, and then all the years that I've been as a financial advisor and planner and meeting and sitting with clients and just understand their story. And one area that I've been very adamant about is that, you hear the term financial literacy and you hear the term generational wealth. And I firmly believe that financial literacy is not a linear process, how it's being taught today. Also, when you look at generational wealth, they're looking at it from a different lens. And my theory was basically you have to take a firm look internally because we have these inherited financial narratives that's been generationally willed upon us unbeknownst to us, which created these encoded financial behaviors. And so everybody is different. It's not a cookie cutter. And what I've discovered when people have read the book and the feedback that I've been getting is that it meets you where you're at. It's not a book that you think you know a lot, and so to speak. You learn so much when you read the book, but you learn about yourself, which is the most important piece. And when we get into this game called life again, in terms of investing, financial literacy, and things of that nature, which is so important. And I was glad you captured that because the book was written for all financial professionals. I feel there's 5 financial professionals. I mentioned them in the book as well. We talked about the 20 inherited financial narratives. If you want to know about those, go pick up the book because they're in there as well. Those are the topics that we really wanted to focus on. But you are also an author as well. And we talked about it earlier that you wrote and produced 2 books, Portfolio Management for Financial Advisors, Volume 1 and 2. So can you give us a little bit of background on what drove you, what inspired you to write both of those books, Volume 1, and you liked it so much you came back and wrote Volume 2? And so, what inspired you to do so?
When I studied financial planning, I love the investment and portfolio management side of things. But what I found was it was a bit too dry. When I practiced as a financial planner for a short while, as a young planner, I asked myself, so when exactly am I going to put these technical stuff that we were taught into practice? You see that what is done in practice is a bit different from how we are taught. It was a bit too, I'll say again, using the word dry, it never really captured the essence of what is done, in practice. And I felt now that I've got all these exposure, how would I want portfolio management to be taught? So that is what got me to write the volume 1 in a way that I felt my student self would want to be taught and given that exposure. And volume 2 came after I had transitioned from an advisor, financial planner to a financial analyst, and then transitioned into academia. And after a bit of research, I felt that there is a certain element of financial planning which is missing. Beyond the individual trying to get their financial lives in order, there is a bigger impact of financial planning, which I felt hasn't been mentioned enough. So the portfolios we invest in tend to be managed by asset managers who collectively have a huge impact if they decide to use their impact. So in South Africa, for example, the inequity in terms of wealth is so huge. And collectively, you would see that, well, as individuals, and of course, as Black people, for example, regardless of the systemic challenges, collectively, there's a lot of monies that we hold in investment firms. So we could possibly then put our monies where our mouths are, by saying, I prefer to invest in these kind of funds because this is what I believe in. And I want the funds I invest in to reflect my values, my belief. Fund managers, for example, could do a lot in terms of influencing the companies in which they invest. And I see there's a lot of focus on ESG, and of late also a lot of focus of funds on concepts around climate change. And these are all good. I support it. But my question has been, we have a bit more imminent issue of growing unemployment sitting at a little over 30%. And there's a huge gender pay gap. There's a huge racial pay gap. I would want my fund manager to do something about it when he or she goes into shareholder meetings. and not simply focus on climate change, which is good because, in my estimations, the chances of potential disenchantment of a huge unemployed group getting sick and tired of their situation and unraveling into societal chaos is higher than, say, global warming destroying us. So why don't we deal with the imminent issues through the opportunities that we have? So I touched on those things in the volume two to say, let's move to the macro level because financial planning has a lot of impact beyond the individual, or the micro level. That is what got me to write volume one and then eventually volume two of Portfolio Management for Financial Advisors.
You did such a great job on one. You say, you know what, I'm going to come back and do two. I'm going to have to buy those books as well because I do teach investment planning as well. And I love how you introduce the fact that each individual is different versus the cookie cutter approach. In most books, as you mentioned earlier, that's what they target on, thinking everyone is the same, or they're writing it for one person, typically themselves, versus looking at the other constituents that are out there. So I love how you introduce that topic because, behavioral finance is a growing field and is so important. And you're talking about what we're trying to get to in regards to financial well-being, stage 5 of the model. So, Dr. Sarpong, as someone deeply engaged in finance education, how do you define generational knowledge in today's context? And why is it often missing in traditional wealth building conversations?
Well, this is a very important topic and it's not discussed enough. One, because especially for the longest time in financial planning, if it can't be quantified, well, then it doesn't matter. So it has remained off the radar for the longest time because, unlike portfolio performance, unlike estimating how much insurance you need, unlike estate planning, generational wealth, generational knowledge, especially, is not something that can be quantified. And for the most part, if we cannot quantify it, it's difficult to introduce it into discussions. And luckily, with the shift into behavioral finance, and now we've been moving into financial therapy, we are beginning to see that there's a lot that influences us beyond the numbers. And the thing now is that it is actually these narratives that shape our behaviors. So, whatever we see in these numbers or don't see are actually influenced by these narratives that drive us. And if we really then want to drive behavioral change, if we want clients to stick with certain investment guidance, then we need to go beyond the numbers to then look at what are the narratives behind the behaviors that drives the numbers.
Absolutely. And again, those inherited financial narratives that I introduce in the book, I have a table of 20. I introduced about 23 to 24, but there are probably even more than that. But what I wanted to identify is that, as you mentioned earlier, that our inherited financial narratives are what drives our decisions and which creates our encoded financial behaviors, which in turn kind of shapes who we are, which creates your financial genetic code. So again,
Right.
generational knowledge and generational wealth is so important, but we're missing so many aspects of it all because we don't understand that everybody is different and everyone comes from a different starting point. Not everyone starts from ground zero. And so their ground zero may be different from my ground zero, which is
Right.
so important, especially when you have couples or partners that come from two different inherited financial narratives, which impact their ability to work together to achieve stage 5 financial well-being. You often find couples come in with different narratives, different beliefs, encoded financial behaviors. They were generously willed to us, unbeknownst to us, and we carry them
Mm.
along, not knowing that as well. So, another question for you. You've likely seen how behavioral patterns can shape financial outcomes. How do you think the concept of a financial genetic code plays out in our day to day money decisions?
Going back to this concept, as I had said earlier, I love the concept of financial genetic code because of the way you explained it or captured it in your book. It's something that keeps evolving. So it's not something that is fixed and imprinted on you. It keeps evolving and you can be conscious of it today. You're not conscious of it tomorrow. And so the part I love about the way you capture it, of course, is that it's something that can be unlearned. It's something that one can fix. And most importantly, when it's fixed, it's not done. It's a continuing process. Every day we encounter new experiences, new challenges, new frustrations. So I might have a good day today and feel like celebrating. I may go off over the board and spend a bit more than I planned to. I may get depressed and feel like, today I'm just going to spend or treat myself to whatever because I deserve it. It's almost like a moving target, and one just has to be conscious of this because it's not something that you just fix and, heal and move on. But as we encounter different experiences, basically, as we live life, it influences our genetic code. And so we almost always have to be conscious of how everyday life keeps shaping our financial genetic code.
And you're absolutely correct because one day you can have a great day, and then the next day, you can oscillate back to some inherited financial narrative that
Mm,
you've encountered, and something can happen that can quickly just shift it. And you say, oh my goodness, this is happening. And, one of the ones that I always say, the scar tissue narrative, because that's so important. Yes, I may have healed. I thought I healed. I look at my skin. Yes, my skin is healed. But when I look there, that scratch, that scar is always there. And it
mm,
always reminds me of something that happened. And we find that in finance, something may have happened when you were young, then your walls in and your home, your internal external ecosystem, something may have happened. And now you're an adult and you carry that on unbeknownst to you. And it's something that
mm.
may happen that may trigger you back to that. Now that's where that depression you mentioned comes into play. So Monday you were fine, but Tuesday you're depressed. Or better yet, Monday at 9 o'clock you were great, but Monday at 12 p.m. something may have happened that said, oh my
Yes,
God, I'm
yes.
going back through this
Mm.
all over again. That's interesting. Doctor, we often educate people about financial literacy, but change doesn't always follow. What do you think stands in the way of applying true financial knowledge?
I think sometimes we forget that the intellect and the emotions are two different things. It's easier when we look at it from the health side, but almost whenever it shifts to the financial side, we almost pretend the intellect and the emotions are the same. We see lots of advertisements about drinking, smoking, and its impacts. I don't think there are smokers out there who do not know the impacts. And when it comes to financial behavior, it is the same. It's just that we assume then that more knowledge leads to, better actions. But that is not necessarily true. One could know all there needs to know about finances and still not behave according to what the knowledge requires of such persons. And if we do not get to that understanding that our emotions and our intellects are not the same, and how we receive education is through you obviously intellectual discourse or discussions. And so I know I need to budget, I know I need to save for the future. That's known. But the doing part is influenced by not just the knowing, but a lot of experiences. One's anxieties, one's inherited narratives, for example, could prevent someone from, behaving in a financially prudent or astute way. So more knowing does not necessarily lead to better decisions. And we just need to be conscious of that and then start asking ourselves what stands in the way of knowledge leading to action. And in most parts, it's their unspoken truth around the narratives that we inherited, which sometimes we never even consciously address.
Absolutely. I was playing golf with one of my closest friends, and we were just joking around. And I paid for the rounds. It was a four. I paid for the rounds this particular time. And he's reading a book, actually. And I said, next time you're going to have to pay. Immediately, jokingly, he said, I thought about my inherited financial narratives. I mean, these traumas, when you mentioned that, we were joking about it. But as he said, those are real. And as you said,
Mm.
those are real. And oftentimes they're uncovered and not brought to the forefront. So we don't know exactly what we're carrying, but we are carrying them. I think I mentioned in the book, there's a lot of phrases that we would say. I know one of my favorite phrases that my dad used to say to me was, I'm so broke, I can't pay attention. And so I used to always hear that, or money don't grow on trees. And so when you
Mm.
think about and you hear these phrases all the time, you begin to echo the same thing to your kids.
Right.
And that was what
Right.
I found myself doing as I was becoming a young parent into I guess, an older parent now. And my kids are growing up and going to college and are in college right now. But I was in a similar situation. So when I wrote the book, it was basically a self inventory of myself
Mm.
and those
Mm.
conversations that I was having with many of my clients. So, what's powerful about everything you've shared so far, Dr. Sarpong, is how it reinforces this truth. You can't build what you haven't first healed. So many people are stuck, not because they don't want better, but because their financial genetic code is wired to survive, not to build. That's what we explored in stages 3 and 4 of the 7 stage generational wealth model, what we just uncovered. How we go from financial trauma to financial literacy is important. If this conversation has resonated with you, make sure you pick up my book, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge, where we break down all 7 stages, where we have segments of transcripts from the podcast season 1 with research and case studies as well. And that's why it's Amazon's bestseller. Now, let's move into the other part of our podcast this afternoon. Dr. Sarpong, from your perspective, is financial literacy enough, or does it have to be coupled with something deeper to lead to long term financial empowerment?
Well, definitely financial literacy can never be enough. And actually, if we focus solely on financial literacy, we may actually end up doing more harm than good when people start believing something might be wrong with them because they know everything that needs to be known, but are not doing what needs to be done. And that is not because there's something wrong with people, that you need to save, but you're not saving. You know you're not supposed to spend excessively, but you still do. When we push financial literacy without acknowledging the narratives, the hidden traumas, the stories that people have inherited or been told, which haven't been corrected, haven't been resolved, then no amount of literacy can help a person move to the next step or heal. So, a case in point, in the health sector, we almost take it for granted now. For example, pretty much every smoker knows the dangers of smoking. But now, the quitting of smoking will not just happen because of providing more information. So, no amount of extra pamphlets, leaflets, handbooks is going to make a smoker change. It takes a bit more than that. But in the financial setting, we tend to take it for granted that, okay, here's a book on financial literacy. This is what you need to know about investing. This is a budgeting app. Why don't you download the next budgeting app? This will not work because the narratives that push people to behave the way they do, in most cases, more powerful than even the knowledge that they acquire because the narratives usually sticks with you for so long, and sometimes it's actually not just that individual, it's generational. So they might be carrying it like some kind of obligation without even knowing consciously that they are carrying such narratives as an obligation. And because of that, no, financial literacy alone will not be enough in helping people achieve generational wealth.
I firmly agree with that wholeheartedly. I worked with a lot of individuals, and oftentimes, and not financial literacy was the narrative, learn financial literacy. But what I
Mm.
found is that although we were able to go over the basics of the basics, something may have happened during the week, during the month, and then meet with them once a month, and they would fall right back to where they were at when they started. And it goes back to what you were saying before. And I firmly believe financial literacy has the opportunity for financial shaming as well. Simply because if you're not doing X, Y, and Z, then you're not doing it the right way. And again, we know that every person is different. Every person's set of circumstances are different as well. So financial literacy, in my opinion, is a band-aid on a much broader problem. And the way they're teaching it is very linear versus the holistic approach with the 7 stage generational wealth model. And that's what we show within the model itself. So, with that being said, what does true financial well being look like to you, not just in terms of net worth, but in terms of peace, stability, and purpose?
So, with a lot of learning on my own path, not just the book or learning or the academic research, but actually learning about life itself, I'm increasingly beginning to accept that true financial wealth or financial freedom begins with owning your narrative. It also needs to extend into being gracious to yourself or being graceful to yourself so that you don't beat yourself up too much when you don't get it right the first time or the second time. Allow yourself some grace. Some narratives are hundreds of years old. So if you haven't been able to get it right in 2 years, in 3 years, allow yourself some space. And that could lead to you beginning to own your narrative. It allows you to subconsciously even rewrite the narratives by being graceful to your own self. Sometimes we don't forgive ourselves. We are quick to forgive others more than we forgive ourselves. But true financial freedom then will come when you own your narrative, allow yourself some grace. But most importantly, when you live, according to your truest version of yourself, which does not necessarily mean no mistakes will be made, but that you are able to consciously self-correct as you progress. That is how, in my opinion, I see true financial freedom.
And that's stage five. We talk about financial well being, financial health equals financial wealth, having that soft landing. I know for myself, when I was able to identify what really made me happy, what I really wanted to accomplish in my stage five, it allowed me to break free from all those shackles that you hear, that you learn, that you think that you want. Rich is transactional versus wealth is legacy. But at the end of the day, once I was able to identify this is what truly will make me happy, then I was able to craft a plan of action to walk towards that. Many times we don't have that in mind because, as you mentioned earlier, we're imposed with a lot of information externally, what we see when we walk out the door. That's why I say walls in and walls out. What I see outside, fear of missing out, also keeping up with the Joneses, as we used to say. Now you have this other term, fear of missing out, right? Those are the things that I was chasing as well as I was progressing in my life. Although I was a financial advisor and planner, I still needed work myself. And I believe that in particular, this book here, what it does, it allows financial professionals, as you mentioned earlier, if they give it a chance and read it, they would be able to do self inventory on themselves because oftentimes they're imposing their financial narratives on their clients unbeknownst to them as well. Things that may have went on with them. They think this is the way it should go. But once you're able to identify what are my inherited financial narratives, now I'm able to identify and sit across the table from someone else and really have a true understanding of where they are coming from. So, as wealth grows, what strategies do you think are most overlooked when it comes to protecting and preserving it for future generations?
I think for the most part, again, in as much as I truly believe in the wealth protection element, very important. Estate planning, the risk management element, super important. But we don't pass on the knowledge element. Most of the time, it's almost always the structures without the knowledge. And by knowledge here, I'm not talking about financial literacy or investment knowledge or estate planning knowledge, but that narrative that allows you to truly weave into this generational wealth comfortably. Because we've noted that even people who inherit immense amounts of wealth sometimes feel extreme burden and distress from the inheritance. And that's because the narratives are wrongfully passed on. Again, when we talk about the narratives, it almost appears like it's only those with the disadvantaged backgrounds who inherit these suboptimal narratives. But even as we're trying to build wealth, we should be conscious of the knowledge we pass on. And we're mistaking the literacy knowledge as the knowledge, but that is not the knowledge I'm talking about. I'm talking about that narrative that allows the next generation to confidently carry on the wealth without the burden of the transition. A lot of people, as they inherit wealth, do not know what to do with it. Some feel ashamed of inheriting such immense wealth. Again, new narratives could be passed on. And so what one needs to do as you're building wealth is to be conscious of what could be the narrative that you might be passing on without you even knowing. We are seeing a lot of, funny enough, those privileged kids growing up and taking on positions tend to now hear a lot about being, what's the word, almost like a nepotism kind of situation. Or, well, they didn't grow up the hard way, they were just lucky, they were born to rich parents. And sometimes it could be subconscious new narratives being imposed on them without even knowing. So, as you are building wealth, planning generational wealth, the kind of knowledge you pass on becomes very critical. Not just the book knowledge, but that narrative that says you deserve goodness. And so when goodness is passed on to you, don't let another person impose their narratives on you. We never 100% stop the narratives. One may transition from a disadvantaged background into some wealth and privilege, but the passing it on could actually unintentionally create another new negative narrative, which you need to guard against as you pass this wealth on. Otherwise, you may find that you did all the heavy lifting, did all the hard work, only to pass on shame. You think you're passing on wealth, but the next person inherited it feels, I don't deserve it. It's now becoming a thing where I think the new generation inheriting wealth from an older generation who really had to go through difficulty are feeling the guilt. And so the new knowledge that is being passed on shouldn't be based on the old narrative of I worked hard and I got here, but also a new story that prevents another negative narrative from being imposed on the next generation. So, generational wealth should come with that generational knowledge, but also knowing that new negative narratives could still creep in. You're not completely insulated from negative narrative, not even when great wealth is passed on to you.
And that's why generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. That is why that
Absolutely.
is so important. Simply because, I mean, again, as you mentioned earlier, we're focusing on wealth, passing up assets and things of that nature, but knowledge is so important. And you reminded me of a client that I had, and I mentioned her in the book, that she was well off. This particular client was well off, but she was a financial prisoner, so to speak. And she felt shame. So her
Mm,
way to rebel would be to spend the money, right? Without even thinking about it. And the parents would say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But she was in rebellion because she received so much all the time, but she
mm,
knew it was connected. And she felt like a dollar sign, if you will. Like, you don't really care about me. When something goes wrong, you're going to pay me money. You're going to give me money. You're going to take me and buy this. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. And as she grew up, she started to resent that because she didn't feel the love, the true love. So her narrative was basically, I feel like a dollar sign to my own parents. And that's an inherited financial narrative. That's on the other side. But as parents, though, we have to be careful because we don't want our kids to go through what we went through. That's why we work so hard. But we have to give them some responsibilities to allow them to understand that it is a struggle, so to speak, but we're there to support and help you, but we just can't give you everything. And we find
right.
ourselves as enablers to our kids as well because we work so hard and we don't want our kids to work that hard. But in essence, we can be hurting them, their growth as well, right? So we have to be very careful
True.
on
True.
how we do that, which is a difficult challenge as a parent. I mean, you have three girls, so you're a girl dad. I have three girls. My girls are older now. So we've got to navigating through that as well with them. Dr. Sarpong, I mean, this has been just an outstanding episode. A couple of final questions for you. If you could change one aspect of how finance is taught or passed down across generations, what would it be?
Well, being a finance academic, there would be a lot that just comes to mind. But I think one thing that really sits with me is the act of being graceful or gracious to oneself, where, there's a lot of narratives we inherit, a lot of narratives that are passed on to us. And in all this, one must be gracious to oneself to say, look, it's a journey. and you're not going to get it right all the time. So one has to be gracious to oneself, and it allows you to center yourself in your own narrative. And from there, you're able to take control of your financial journey, knowing that it's not linear. There will be some bumps, there will be some backsliding, if that's the right word to use. But in every step of the way, showing your own self some grace allows you to also extend grace to those who came before you, who also tried in their own way and gave out their best and, didn't get it right all the time, but you're here, and just that you are taking the step is good enough. And it allows you then to at least start owning your own narratives. And from there, a lot of good can happen. And I think that is the one thing that I would love to teach or to pass on if I'm giving financial education.
Absolutely. Your financial genetic code can be altered, unlike your DNA. This is one thing that you can alter. That's why it's code, like you're writing code on a computer. And those inherited financial narratives, you may have them, but you can give yourself some self-talk as well. Those affirmations that are so important to move you forward. So, final question. How do people get in contact with you, and what else do you have on the horizon?
I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn is just Prince Sarpong. That's pretty much my most active social media. I have other social medias, but I'm never really active. So I'd say on my LinkedIn. Currently, I just finished a book which I've submitted to the publisher Springer on financial therapy for men. So trying to now engage men. Interestingly enough, pretty much these discussions around meeting people where they are is some of the things I touch on as well, to meet men where they are, not opposed to where they should be, imposing on men where they should be or what they should do. They need to meet men where they are. And that has been my current focus. Also actively involved in the AI space, but not from the technical side, but more of this is something that will affect the entire humanity. And we all need to get involved in a way to kind of contribute to the future of AI and not just leave it in the hands of the tech guys or the computer guys, because it will have a lot of impact on how we deal with our finances. Our financial lives as we know it will also be impacted by even the chatbots we interact with. A lot of people are now taking financial advice from ChatGPT and so on. And so again, it becomes important that we, especially as financial advisors, financial educators, get involved in the conversations around artificial intelligence. So these are the two main things that I'm currently involved in at the moment.
I wish we would have had this conversation months earlier, or I would have finished the book months early, because you could have used some of my stuff cited in your upcoming book as well. I'm sure there's some areas that we could have used in there as well.
Absolutely.
But so maybe you can get it back and say, hey, listen, I want to add, some narrative, financial narrative cite, Dr. Wallace book on this as well too. But, Dr. Sarpong, this has been such a dynamic and deeply insightful episode. I want to thank you, not just for sharing your expertise, but giving language to the weight of financial trauma, the confusion around inherited financial patterns, and the hope of building something different. To our listeners, if today's episode resonated, I encourage you to grab a copy of my book, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge. It's more than a guide. It's a blueprint for transforming financial survival and generational prosperity. And to Dr. Prince Sarpong, on behalf of myself, our producer, Ray Haycraft, and the entire Future Wealth Builder community, as we always say, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And I'll see you on the next episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. Thank you for joining us on the New Wealth Wave podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. Our show is edited and produced by Ray Haycraft. To dive deeper into the world of financial wisdom and learn how to create your financial footprints, head to our website at www.drjwallace.com. For more updates and exclusive content, connect with us on social media by searching Dr. Joaquin Wallace. And if you have questions and comments, feel free to email us at thenewwealthwavepodcast@gmail.com. Remember, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And as always, thanks for listening. The content presented in this podcast is strictly for educational purposes and should not be taken as investment advice. The views and opinions expressed by our guests may not necessarily reflect those of the New Wealth Wave podcast and its host or producers. Listeners are urged to exercise discretion and judgment before making any financial or investment decisions. Always consult with a financial professional or advisor before taking any action based on the content of this podcast. If you're enjoying the New Wealth Wave podcast, we appreciate if you leave us a review. We're always open to topic suggestions and guest recommendations. Feel free to reach out to us directly with your thoughts and feedback. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the New Wealth Wave podcast.